The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning, and nobody on Merritt Lane said a word out loud. But they watched. Through parted curtains and over the tops of mailboxes, the neighbors of Harwick stood witness to something they could not quite name. It was not grief. It was not a move. It was something faster and more deliberate than either of those things, the kind of organized dismantling that happens when people have already decided the outcome and are simply executing the steps. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment before getting out of the car. Ruth did not move from the porch. But that is not where this story begins. It begins in the summer of 1991 on a Saturday morning in a kitchen on Merritt Lane with the sound of a handsaw moving through pine. Harold Calloway was 60 years old that summer, thick through the forearms in the way of men who have worked with their hands since before they were men, and he was cutting boards at the kitchen table with the focused economy of someone who has measured twice and does not intend to measure again. Outside the window, a road crew was laying fresh asphalt on the eastern extension of County Route 9. Harold watched them through the glass while he worked, not with the idle interest of a man who has nothing better to look at, but with the particular attention of someone reading information that other people were walking past without noticing. He had purchased 4 parcels of land along that eastern corridor in the previous 2 years. Scrub fields mostly flat and unremarkable, the kind of ground that showed up in county tax records as agricultural holdover and changed hands for prices that reflected what they currently were rather than what they were about to become. The sellers had been glad to unload them. Harold had been glad to buy. Ruth stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall watching her husband work. She had learned over 31 years of marriage that Harold, in this particular state of concentration, was not to be interrupted with questions, but that he would explain himself when he was ready, which he always did and always completely. He set down the saw and looked at the opening he had made in the kitchen wall. 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, framed cleanly into the existing structure. He had reinforced the framing himself over the previous 2 weekends, working alone, telling Ruth he was addressing some settling in the wall that he had been meaning to fix for years. That had been technically accurate. He said, "Come look at this." She came and stood beside him and looked into the space he had made. He told her what it was for. He told her about the land he had been buying, about why he believed the city would grow toward it, about the documents and deeds and investment records that needed a place that was not a bank and not a filing cabinet in an office and not anywhere that required another person's knowledge or another institution's cooperation to access. He told her about the safe he intended to set into the concrete of the foundation, about the filing cabinets he had already sourced from a business liquidation in Columbus. Then he told her about the door. He had engineered the mechanism himself, a thing of simple permanent physics, a latch set into the framing that engaged when pressure was applied to a specific point on the face of the third shelf. Not the corner, behind, not an obvious seam, a point where the grain of the wood met itself at an angle invisible, unless you knew to look, accessible only if you knew exactly where to press. He took her hand and placed her fingers on the shelf. He guided them to the point. He pressed gently his hand over hers until the panel shifted. He said, "Now you do it alone." She did. The panel opened. He said again. She did it again without his hand finding the point from memory. He said, "You'll know this the way you know your own name. And one day, if I'm not here, you'll come in here and you'll know what to do." Ruth looked at the small room that her husband had built with his own hands inside the walls of the house where they had raised their children. She said, "How long have you been planning this?" He thought about it. He said, "Since the first time I bought land that other people thought was worthless." She said, "And the children?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Money corrupts people easily, Ruth, especially when they know what's coming. I want to know who our children are before they know what they stand to gain." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "All right." He closed the panel. The wall was seamless. The pantry shelves stood plain and unremarkable, the same as every pantry shelf in every kitchen in Harwick, Ohio. Harold Calloway died in the spring of 1993, 2 years after he built the room at the age of 62. He died in the back bedroom of the house on Merritt Lane, and Ruth sat beside him through the final weeks with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have decided not to waste a moment of the time that remains. His company passed to a former employee who bought it at a fair price. His tools stayed in the garage. His name went on the deeds of 4 parcels of land on the eastern edge of Harwick that were at the time of his death still mostly scrub field. Ruth knew what was in the room. She knew where the documents were filed. She knew the combination of the safe and the address of Walter Briggs's office and the full scope of what Harold had built in the years when no one was paying attention. She kept all of it. She kept it the way Harold had asked her to, quietly and completely managing the accounts through Walter, watching the eastern quarter of Harwick transform over 3 decades from empty fields into the commercial spine of a growing county. The closest she had ever come to telling Dennis was the summer he turned 26. He had just gotten his real estate license, and he was full of the particular energy of a young man who has found the thing he is good at and cannot stop talking about it. He had come home for a weekend and sat at the kitchen table on Saturday morning, telling Ruth about a parcel of land out on the east side of the county that a developer was trying to acquire, talking about the price per acre and the zoning and the projected growth of the corridor, as though he had discovered something nobody else could see. Ruth had listened to him describe with considerable accuracy exactly what Harold had seen 15 years earlier when he started buying the same parcels. She had sat across the table from her son and watched him arrive at her husband's conclusions through his own reasoning, and she had felt something that was equal parts pride and grief and the particular loneliness of being the only person in the room who understood the full dimensions of what was happening. She had almost said it. She had opened her mouth with the actual intention of saying, "Dennis, your father bought land out there in 1989. She had gotten as far as your father before something stopped her. Not Harold's voice, not a rule, just the clear, sudden understanding that if she told Dennis now, in this moment, when he was 26 and ambitious and hungry, it would not be a gift. It would be a weight he would carry in one direction only. She closed her mouth. She said, "Sounds like you have a good eye for this market." Dennis had smiled and changed the subject. She never told her children, not because she did not love them, because Harold had been right and she had had 32 years to confirm it. The first time she went into the room alone was 3 weeks after Harold's funeral. She had told herself she was going in to check on the documents to make sure the humidity had not caused any damage, to confirm that everything was where it was supposed to be. Those were reasonable things to check. She went in the morning before the children came over, and she stood in the small space with the filing cabinet drawer open in front of her and did not look at the documents at all. She looked at the workbench Harold had built along the back wall, at the level he had hung on a nail beside it, at the pair of reading glasses he had left on a small shelf above the safe. He had kept a second pair in here. She had not known that. She stood there for a long time. Then she closed the drawer, turned off the flashlight that she had brought, and went back through the pantry into the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table and did not cry, because Harold had not been a man who believed in crying over things you could not change, and she had spent 31 years learning to see the world the way he saw it. She managed the trust through Walter Briggs the way Harold had set it up, with annual reviews and careful documentation, in the specific patience of someone playing a long game. The land appreciated the way Harold had said it would, faster in some places than even he had projected. By the mid-2000s, the eastern quarter of Harwick had become unrecognizable from the scrub fields she had watched him survey on weekend drives, and Ruth would sometimes go out of her way on errands just to drive past those corners and think about the man who had looked at nothing and known what was coming. There were moments over the years when she almost told them. Dennis, when he started his real estate career, had come home one Sunday and spent the whole dinner talking about the eastern corridor in a way that made her set down her fork. But she had not told him then. Beverly, during a visit when she had a few glasses of wine, and told Ruth that she sometimes wondered if she had missed something by leaving Harwick so young. Ray, once sitting in the kitchen late at night after everyone else had gone to bed, quietly telling her he was in financial trouble and didn't know what to do. She had listened to Ray that night for a long time. She had made him tea. She had told him that he was capable of more than he believed, and that the best solutions were usually the ones a person found themselves. She had not opened the pantry door. She had held the secret the way you hold something fragile in both hands for a very long time, knowing that the moment you set it down, things will change in ways you cannot take back. Now Ruth Calloway was 76 years old, and she lived alone in the brick house at the end of Merritt Lane, and her children visited rarely enough that she had long since stopped adjusting her expectations to accommodate the possibility. She kept the house the way she kept everything, through discipline, without complaint, and with the specific pride of a person who has decided that needing help and asking for it are two different things that do not have to occur simultaneously. She changed her own light bulbs, balancing on the step stool with the careful deliberateness of someone who respects the distance to the floor. She kept a handwritten ledger for her monthly expenses, entering each item in the same column format she had used since 1978. She went out to the back garden every morning to check on what was growing and what needed attention, and she pulled the dead things out herself rather than leaving them to discourage the living ones. In the kitchen on the second shelf of the refrigerator, she kept a small section stocked with the particular foods her three children had preferred when they lived at home. Dennis's sharp cheddar, Beverly's plain yogurt, Ray's orange juice in the small bottles he had always liked. She had maintained this habit for years, quietly replacing items as they expired, and she had not examined the habit closely enough to name what it was. The neighbor who knew her best was Vera Hutchins, 71 years old, a former elementary school teacher who had lived in the house to the left of Ruth's for 20 years, and who possessed the particular quality of attention that made her the kind of neighbor worth having. Vera knew the names of all three of Ruth's children, knew that Harold had run a construction company, knew that Ruth had worked as a bookkeeper well into her 60s, and knew because she paid attention to the things that people revealed without meaning to, that Ruth Calloway was a woman who had decided loneliness was preferable to asking for more than people were willing to give. On the afternoon before Ruth fell, Vera was in her own kitchen when she looked across the yard and saw Ruth standing in front of the pantry, not reaching for anything, not moving, just standing with both hands at her sides, looking at the cabinet with a steadiness that was different from ordinary thought. Vera watched for what felt like a long time, though it was probably less than 5 minutes. Then she went to the window and knocked on the glass. Ruth turned. She smiled. She said through the glass, "I'm just checking that I haven't forgotten something." Vera did not ask what she meant. That evening, after Ruth had eaten her dinner and washed the dishes, the pressure started at the back of her head. It was not the first time she had felt something like it, a heaviness that came and went that her doctor had noted, and that Ruth had noted privately as one of the several things she intended to address when she had time. It moved forward across her right temple with a speed that left no room for the preparations she might otherwise have made. She reached for the counter. Her legs made a decision she had not authorized. She did not make it to the phone on the counter. She did not make it to the door. She went down onto the kitchen floor, and in the last coherent moment before the darkness came, some part of her turned toward the pantry, and her arm extended in that direction, as though the instinct that overrides thought in extremity knew exactly what she would want confirmed. Her fingertips reached the base of the cabinet and stopped. The paramedic who documented the scene noted it in the report as a patient found on the kitchen floor, arm extended toward the cabinet. He wrote it because it was what he saw, not because he understood it. It was Vera who called. She had been watching without entirely meaning to for the kitchen light to go off, which it always did by 8 o'clock in the evening, which was Ruth's habit, which Vera had absorbed over 20 years of adjacent living, the way you absorb the patterns of weather. At 9:30, the light was still on. Vera put on her shoes. She found Ruth on the floor and called 911 and held Ruth's hand until the ambulance arrived. She stood on the sidewalk in the October dark and watched the vehicle leave, and then she stood there a while longer, looking at the lit kitchen window, with the particular feeling of someone who knows something has shifted, but cannot yet see the shape of the change. She had no key to Ruth's house. Ruth had never offered one, and Vera had never asked. She understood now, standing in the dark, that there were things about Ruth Calloway that she did not know, and that the absence of a spare key was probably not an oversight. The three children were called that night. They arrived at Hawick Regional Medical Center within 2 hours of each other, which was perhaps the most coordinated thing they had done as a family in several years. Dennis Calloway was 52 years old and had been in real estate for 25 of them. He ran a mid-sized brokerage in Columbus that had been profitable through most of its history and had not been profitable for the past 2 years, a situation he was managing with the specific focused calm of a man who has been in difficult markets before and believes he can work his way out of this one provided nothing else goes wrong. He had visited his mother twice in the past year. He knew this. He had a reason for each missed occasion, and he knew those too. Beverly Calloway Pierce was 49 and had built her career in marketing through a combination of genuine talent and the willingness to work harder than the people around her, which had taken her from Hawick to Columbus to a senior position at a firm that operated nationally. She had married a corporate attorney named David Moore, who earned enough that money was not a practical concern in her daily life. What Beverly needed and had needed since she left Hawick at 22 was not money, but the confirmation that she had been right to leave, that the life she had built was worth what it had cost her to build it. She was not aware she needed this. She thought she was simply a practical person. Ray Calloway was 45 and was the only one of the three who still occasionally thought about his childhood in a way that was not purely historical. He remembered the smell of the garage on Saturday mornings, the specific combination of motor oil and sawdust that meant his father was working, which meant everything was in its right place. He also owed $38,000 to his brother-in-law, the result of a restaurant investment that had failed in its first year, and his wife had made the parameters of the situation clear: resolve it before the end of the year, or face consequences that she had not specified, but that Ray understood to be serious. The last time all three of them had been in the house on Merritt Lane at the same time was Thanksgiving 14 months ago. Dennis had arrived first and walked through the rooms with the look he always had in other people's houses, taking note of things. Beverly had come straight from the airport with a rolling carry-on. She parked in the hallway, still half in her work mode, answering emails on her phone, while Ruth carried dishes from the kitchen. Ray had shown up an hour late with a bottle of wine he had clearly bought at a gas station, grinning in the way he grinned when he knew he had gotten away with something. Dinner had been fine. That was the word for it. Fine. The food was good and the conversation stayed on safe ground, and at no point did anyone say anything that could not have been said to a polite stranger. Ruth had set the table with the good plates, the ones she only brought out 4 times a year, and at some point during the meal, Dennis had picked up his fork and looked at the plate, and Ruth had watched him not say what he was thinking, which was that the plates were probably worth something. They had all left by 8 o'clock. Beverly had a morning flight. Dennis said he had an early call. Ray said he had promised his wife he would be back before the kids went to bed. Ruth had stood on the porch and watched the last set of taillights disappear around the corner at the end of Merritt Lane, then gone back inside and washed the good plates by hand and put them away, and sat at the kitchen table for a while before going to bed. She had not told any of them that she was having occasional headaches. She had not told them that her doctor had mentioned her blood pressure twice in the past 6 months. She had not told them because telling them would have made them worry in the wrong direction, and she had enough experience with the three of them to know exactly which direction that would be. They gathered in the hallway outside the ICU after the attending physician had given them the summary. Moderate stroke, swelling in the brain. The next 48 to 72 hours would be significant. The long-term prognosis was uncertain, but not without reason for optimism. The doctor left. The three of them stood in the hallway. Ray spoke first. He said, "Is the house in her name alone?" Beverly said, "Ray." He said, "I'm just asking." Dennis answered because he knew the answer, and because having the answer was in some context the same as having a position. He said the property was in Ruth's name only. He said that without a will or a clear directive, Ohio intestate law would divide the estate equally among the three of them if it came to that. Beverly said, "She's not dead, Dennis." He said, "I know that, but the medical bills will start accumulating from tonight." What followed was not an argument in the way that loud things are arguments. It was a negotiation conducted in low voices by people who understood that the hallway of an ICU was not the place for volume. Ray wanted speed. Dennis wanted control of the process. Beverly wanted the decision to be hers without appearing to want that. They talked for 20 minutes and reached a tacit agreement that no one stated explicitly. They would begin assessing the situation at the house, and they would make necessary arrangements, and they would proceed in a way that was, as Dennis put it, practical. A nurse named Patricia Nolan walked past them twice during this conversation. The second time she slowed almost imperceptibly, caught Dennis's eye for a fraction of a second, and continued on. She went into Ruth's room to check the monitors. The readings were stable. She noted with the professional attention she applied to everything that Ruth's heart rate had shown a brief and minor elevation during the period when her children had been speaking in the hallway. Not clinically significant, not something she would record, but something she would remember. She stayed in the room a moment longer than her checklist required. She looked at the woman in the bed who was 68 pounds lighter than authority and wearing a hospital gown, and she made a decision that was not in any manual she had ever been trained from. From that night on, she would speak to Ruth during her checks, whether Ruth could hear her or not. The following afternoon, Dennis drove to the house on Merritt Lane to find Ruth's insurance documents. He let himself in with the spare key from the lockbox Ruth had registered with the county in case of emergency, a practical measure that had anticipated exactly this kind of necessity. The house was quiet in a way that houses are quiet when their inhabitants are absent rather than simply asleep. Dennis moved through the rooms with the professional, unconscious habit of a man who has walked through hundreds of houses in a working capacity and cannot help assessing them that way. He noted the condition of the floors, the age of the windows, the state of the roof as visible from the upstairs hallway. In the study, he found Ruth's desk and opened the center drawer. Insurance card vehicle registration, a small envelope containing what turned out to be receipts from a pharmacy going back 3 years. He opened the right-hand drawer and found a folder of utility bills, a booklet of stamps, and at the back underneath a folded map of Ohio that looked as though it had not been opened in 15 years, a plain brown envelope. The envelope was not sealed. On the front in handwriting he recognized immediately because he had grown up seeing it on notes left on the kitchen table and labels on jars in the garage. His father's handwriting, large and unhurried, and built for permanence, Ruth, when you need to remember. Dennis stood at his mother's desk for a moment. Then he opened the envelope. Inside was a small key on a plain ring, the kind of key that opened a combination safe as a secondary mechanical backup, and a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. His father's hand again. The room behind the kitchen holds everything that matters. The safe key is in this envelope. If I'm not there, you know what to do. Dennis read it twice. He looked up from the paper and looked at the doorway to the kitchen visible from where he stood. He walked into the kitchen. He stood in front of the pantry. He opened the door and looked at the shelves: canned tomatoes, a box of oatmeal, a jar of honey, a few other items. He looked at the back wall of the pantry. He knocked on it with his knuckle. It sounded solid. He knocked on the side wall, also solid. He reached in and ran his palm along the surfaces of each shelf, pressing as he went. He covered the first shelf, the second, the third. He pressed the corners, the edges, the midpoints. He pressed the third shelf at the lower right corner, then slightly left of that, then along the front edge. He was perhaps 2 inches from the precise intersection of wood grain where Harold had set the mechanism, and the pantry gave him nothing. He withdrew his arm. He stood in the kitchen for another minute, holding the key and the note. Then he put both back in the envelope, put the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket, and left the house without telling his brother or his sister what he had found. He drove home. He sat in his car in his own driveway for a while. Then he took out his phone and called Pete Harlow, who was a building contractor he had known for 7 years, and who had the particular quality of discretion that Dennis had come to appreciate in people who work near money. He said, "Pete, I need you to run an ultrasound scan on a wall. Nothing official, just the two of us." Pete said, "Whose wall?" Dennis said, "My mother's kitchen." A pause. Dennis said, "I think my father built something inside it." He hung up and sat in the driveway for another few minutes, turning the envelope over in his hands. Then he went inside his house and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon he did not drink and sat at his kitchen table and thought about his father's handwriting. He had not seen it in 32 years, not on anything new, and there was something disorienting about encountering it now in this context, as though Harold had reached across 3 decades to hand him a problem he was not sure he was equipped to solve. Dennis was good at problems. He had built a career on them. But the problems he was good at had prices attached, and this one did not, and that made it harder to know which direction to move. Across town, Beverly was in the hotel room she had booked when it became clear she would not be driving back to Columbus that night. She sat on the edge of the bed with her shoes still on and called her husband and gave him a summary of the situation in the careful, precise way she gave summaries at work, hitting the key points without unnecessary texture. He asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. He said to let him know if she needed anything. She said she would. She hung up and looked at the hotel room wall for a moment, then opened her laptop and pulled up 3 months of real estate listings in the Harwick area just to understand the market. She told herself it was research. She looked at the numbers for 45 minutes before she admitted to herself that she was not looking at the market. She was looking at her mother's house. Ray did not go to a hotel. He drove to Merritt Lane and parked across the street from his mother's house and sat in the dark looking at it. The lights were off. The house looked smaller than he remembered it looking when he was a child, though he knew that was not possible, that houses did not shrink, that it was only him who had changed scale. He thought about the birthday card he had written in green crayon, and he thought about the box he had written "Donate" on, and he thought about the fact that he had done those 2 things in the same afternoon without registering the distance between them. He sat there for a longer time. Then he drove to a motel on Route 9 and lay on top of the covers without sleeping, staring at the ceiling while the highway noise came through the window in slow, irregular waves. That night, in a room on the 4th floor of Harwick Regional Medical Center, Patricia Nolan stood beside Ruth's bed and checked the monitors and said, speaking to the silence the way she had been doing for several days now, The leaves are really coming down out there, Mrs. Calloway. They get that wet leaf smell when the temperature drops kind of sweet and heavy at the same time. I grew up in Indiana and it smells like home to me. I hope it smells like something good to you too. The monitors showed what they always showed. Patricia made her notes and turned to go. Behind her, the heart rate trace on the nearest screen held its steady line. Somewhere across town in the house on Merritt Lane, the pantry stood closed and unremarkable in the dark kitchen, holding what it had always held, waiting with the patience of things built to outlast the people who made them. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday. Ron Sutter, the estate buyer, wore a canvas vest with too many pockets and carried a clipboard, and the professional detachment of a man who has learned to see objects rather than histories. He had been referred by a colleague of Beverly's whose mother had passed the previous spring. The referral came with a note, efficient, discreet fair market on most items. Dennis had made the calls the night before. He had done it from the parking lot of a gas station on Route 9, sitting in his car after midnight, working through his phone with the systematic focus of a man running a project rather than grieving a possibility. He had told himself this was the responsible way to handle a difficult situation. He had told himself this often enough in the past 24 hours that it had begun to feel true. Ron Sutter walked through the house the way a contractor walks through a property before demolition. He lifted objects, turned them over, set them back down. In the living room, he paused at the mantel clock, a mahogany piece with a brass face that Harold had bought at an estate sale in 1984. He wrote something on his clipboard. $40, he said, maybe $60 if the movement still worked. Dennis nodded without looking at the clock itself. Ray was in the back bedroom working through the closet. He pulled down boxes from the upper shelf and set them on the bare mattress, opening each one with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had learned not to look too carefully. In the third box, he found a stack of birthday cards, handmade construction paper, and dried glue, the kind children make when they are young enough to believe that effort is the same as love. He recognized his own handwriting on the top card, crooked letters spelling out "Happy Birthday, Mom" in green crayon. He stood there for a moment with the box in his hands. Then he closed it, wrote "Donate" on the outside with a black marker, and set it by the door. Beverly had claimed the study. She moved through Ruth's desk drawers with the focused energy of a woman used to closing things out, used to the particular efficiency that comes from treating sentiment as a variable that can be managed. She sorted into 3 categories: keep for legal purposes, shred, and general donation. She worked quickly, which meant she worked without reading most of what she touched. The envelope from Walter Briggs's office appeared between a folded telephone bill from August and a birthday card that had never been sent. The return address was printed in the upper left corner, Briggs & Associates Estate Law, downtown Harwick. The envelope was sealed and had never been opened. Beverly held it for perhaps 3 seconds. She noted the sender, noted the word estate, and placed it in the box marked papers without breaking the seal. That box would sit under 2 others for the next 4 days. Vera Hutchins watched the white cargo van from her kitchen window while she washed her breakfast dishes. She watched Ron Sutter carry out the mantel clock under his arm and load it into the van beside a stack of dining chairs that had seated this family for 40 years. She set down her dish towel. Something happening on the other side of that window felt less like a family handling a difficult situation and more like a clearing of evidence. She dried her hands, walked across the yard, and knocked on the front door. Dennis answered. He was wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the kind of deliberate casualness that people adopt when they want to appear unbothered. He looked at Vera the way a man looks at a complication he had not scheduled. She did not waste time on pleasantries. She asked if he had a power of attorney document. She used those exact words, power of attorney, because her late husband had been a real estate attorney for 31 years, and she had learned enough from living alongside that work to know which questions cut through. Dennis said they were family and that the situation was being handled responsibly. Vera said she had not asked about responsibility. She had asked about legal authorization. He held her gaze for a moment with the steady patience of a man who had negotiated difficult conversations professionally for decades. Then he said they would make sure everything was handled correctly, thanked her for her concern, and gently closed the door. Vera walked back across the yard. She did not feel dismissed. She felt confirmed in what she had suspected since the Tuesday morning she watched the lights stay on too late in Ruth's kitchen. She went inside and sat at her own table and thought about what Ruth had said to her 3 years earlier when Vera's husband was dying, and Ruth had appeared in the hospital waiting room at 7 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and no explanation. When Vera had asked her why she came, Ruth had said, because that is what people do for each other. Vera picked up her phone. She did not have Walter Briggs's number, but she had seen the name on that envelope, and she had seen the address, and she had 40 minutes before her 11 o'clock physical therapy appointment. She put on her coat. The offices of Briggs and Associates were on the second floor of a building on Commerce Street that Vera had driven past hundreds of times without ever having reason to enter. The receptionist at the front desk was a young woman who looked at Vera with the polite neutrality of someone trained to manage unexpected arrivals without showing surprise. Vera said she needed to speak with Walter Briggs about a client of his. She said it was time-sensitive. She said she was not a lawyer and not a family member, and she understood he could not discuss confidential matters, but she had information she believed he would want to hear. The receptionist said Mr. Briggs was in a meeting. Vera said she would wait. She sat in the waiting area for 22 minutes. She used the time to organize in her head exactly what she intended to say in the order she intended to say it, the way she had once organized lesson plans for a classroom of 9-year-olds who needed information delivered clearly and without detours. Walter Briggs came out himself. He was a compact man in a gray suit who looked at her with the careful attention of someone who has learned to assess situations quickly and accurately. He said he understood she had something for him. She told him about the moving truck, about Ron Sutter and the dining chairs and the mantel clock, about the papers box and the envelope, with his firm's return address sitting unopened in a donation pile, about Dennis closing the door in her face when she asked about legal authorization. She was precise, and she did not editorialize, and she finished in under 4 minutes. Walter Briggs listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who was not thinking about what to say next, but about what had just been confirmed. He said, "Mrs. Hutchins, I am not able to discuss the details of any client matter, but I can tell you that the information you have shared is useful and that the situation you are describing has not gone unaddressed." Vera looked at him. She said, "Is Ruth going to be all right?" He said, "I genuinely don't know the medical answer to that, but I can tell you that she made arrangements a long time ago precisely for situations like this one." That was enough. Vera thanked him, stood up, picked up her purse, and walked back out onto Commerce Street. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she understood enough. Someone had thought ahead. Someone always had. The morning Dennis brought Pete Harlow to the house, he arrived before Beverly and Ray. He had thought about this deliberately. Whatever was behind that wall, he wanted to see it first. Pete Harlow was 55 years old, thick through the shoulders with calloused hands and the particular quiet of a man who has spent a lifetime building things that other people took credit for. He ran the handheld scanner along the wall behind the pantry cabinet, moving it in slow horizontal passes from floor to ceiling. The device made no sound. Pete watched the readout. Then he stopped moving and looked at Dennis. "There was a void space behind that wall," he said. "Approximately 6 by 8, maybe a little more. Double wall reinforced framing. Whoever built this knew what they were doing and wanted it to last." Dennis stared at the pantry cabinet. He opened the door and reached inside, running his palm along each shelf from top to bottom. On the third shelf, he slowed, pressing his fingers along the underside, then the front face, then across the back panel. He found the lower right area and pressed. Nothing happened. He shifted his fingers and pressed again. Still nothing. He stood there with his arm inside the cabinet, elbow bent, feeling along a surface that gave him nothing back. He was perhaps 2 inches from the precise point Harold had engineered, the intersection of wood grain that was invisible unless you knew to look for it. Dennis did not know to look for it. Pete said quietly that he could open it another way. A small access cut in the adjacent drywall, nothing that could not be patched before showing. Dennis withdrew his arm from the cabinet. He closed the pantry door. He stood in the middle of the empty kitchen for a long moment, looking at the floor. "No," he said. "Not yet." His mother was still alive. Pete looked at him. He picked up his equipment bag from the counter and slung it over his shoulder. At the back door, he paused and said something that Dennis would spend several days trying to stop thinking about. He said, "Dennis, whoever built that room built it for one specific person to open, not for you." Then he left. Dennis was still standing in the kitchen when Beverly arrived 20 minutes later. She saw the faint marks Pete's equipment had left near the wall. She saw Dennis standing in the center of the room with the expression of a man who had just come very close to something and stopped. She asked what he was doing. He told her about the void space. He told her about Pete, about the scanner, about the wall behind the pantry. He told her because Beverly was going to find out anyway, and because he had learned a long time ago that information kept is only useful until someone else finds it first. Beverly walked to the pantry and opened the door. She looked at the shelves with the same assessing gaze she used in board meetings when someone presented data she did not yet understand. She said it looked like shelves to her. Dennis said Pete's scanner did not lie. She closed the pantry door and turned to face him. The conversation that followed was not loud. The worst arguments between people who have known each other their whole lives rarely are. Beverly said he had brought an outside contractor into their mother's home without telling either sibling, which was precisely the kind of unilateral move she had come to expect from him, and which was also exactly the kind of move that could expose them to liability if Ruth recovered and chose to view it that way. Dennis said Ruth would not view it that way. Beverly said, "Are you sure about that? Are you certain that the woman you have visited 3 times in the last 14 months would agree that you had her best interests in mind?" The number landed somewhere it was meant to land. Dennis did not answer. Ray arrived in the middle of this and reading the room with the instinctive social calibration of a man who had spent his life navigating tense situations with inadequate resources, immediately attempted to redirect the conversation toward the practical. He said it did not matter who found what. What mattered was that they sell the house and divide the proceeds before things got any more complicated. Both Dennis and Beverly looked at him with the particular shared weariness of older siblings who have spent 4 decades watching a younger one try to simplify things that are not simple. Neither of them said what they were thinking. Neither of them needed to. That evening, Dennis sat in his car outside the house for a long time after his siblings left. He took Harold's note from his inside jacket pocket and unfolded it on the steering wheel. He had read it so many times that the fold lines were beginning to soften. He read it again. Then he called Walter Briggs's office. The phone rang 4 times before a woman picked up. She was professional, unhurried, and entirely unmoved by Dennis's attempt to establish a connection between himself and the firm. She said Mr. Briggs's client files were confidential. When Dennis asked whether his mother had an active file with their office, she said she was not able to answer that question and thanked him for calling. He sat in the car after he hung up. The street was getting dark. The for sale sign that the realtor had planted in the front yard that afternoon caught the light from the neighbor's porch lamp, and Dennis looked at it for a long time. He had been in real estate long enough to know that you never truly owned a property until the title was clear. The liens were searched, and every previous claim had been accounted for. He had seen families lose houses over trusts they did not know existed. He understood sitting in that car that he had been operating on assumptions and that assumptions in property matters were the most expensive thing a person could carry. He drove to his hotel. He lay on the bed without sleeping, turning the note over in his mind, turning the blank face of the pantry wall over in his mind, turning the 2 inches he had not reached over in his mind until the room went gray with early morning. 3 miles away in a room on the 4th floor of Harwick Regional Medical Center, Ruth Calloway opened her eyes. It happened the way Patricia Nolan had been told. It sometimes happens with strokes of this kind, not with a dramatic return, but with a gradual reassembly like a radio finding its signal. One moment there was nothing behind those eyes, and then there was something, and Patricia, who had been in this room dozens of times over the past 11 days, and had developed the habit of speaking aloud during her checks, was in the middle of a sentence about the weather when Ruth turned her head and looked directly at her. Patricia pressed the call button with one hand and did not move the other from Ruth's wrist. The doctors came quickly. There were lights and questions in the standard assessments. Ruth answered them slowly but correctly. She knew her name. She knew the year. She knew she was in a hospital. When the attending asked if she knew why she was there, she said she had a stroke in her kitchen on a Thursday evening in October, that her neighbor must have called for help, and that she needed to make a phone call. The attending said she needed rest first. Ruth said she had been resting for 11 days. After the doctors finished and the room settled again, Patricia brought a cup of water with a straw and sat in the chair beside the bed. Ruth drank slowly, looking at the ceiling. Then she asked Patricia directly, "How much do you know about what has been happening at my house?" Patricia considered her answer for a moment. She had overheard conversations in the hallway. She had noticed things. She told Ruth enough. She did not editorialize. She said that her children had been in the house, that there appeared to be an ongoing effort to prepare the property for sale, and that a woman named Vera Hutchins had come to the hospital looking for her. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she asked Patricia for her phone. She dialed from memory 7 digits she had not dialed in several months, but had never stopped knowing. The phone rang twice. Walter Briggs answered on the 3rd ring, and when he heard Ruth's voice, he let out a long, slow breath that was not quite relief and not quite surprise, but something that had elements of both. She asked him how much damage had been done. He told her the contracts being discussed with the realtor had no legal standing. The trust was intact. Nothing had been signed. But someone had pulled a title search on the property through the county recorder's office, and the request had not come from his firm. Ruth said Dennis. Walter said possibly. She asked him to update the trust documentation. He said he had anticipated this call and had the paperwork ready. She confirmed the terms she wanted. He said he would prepare everything for a witnessed video conference at her convenience and that the notarization could be handled remotely under Ohio law. She said tomorrow morning. Then she asked about the house itself. He told her the house would stay exactly as she had always intended. That part had never been in question. She thanked him. She handed the phone back to Patricia without explanation. Patricia looked at the phone and then at Ruth. In 11 days of sitting in this room, speaking into the silence and watching the monitors, Patricia had formed a clear enough picture of this woman to understand what she had just witnessed. Ruth Calloway had been unconscious for 11 days. She had woken up determined the scope of the problem and placed one phone call to the right person. She had not panicked. She had not cried. She had not called her children first. Patricia said nothing. She refilled the water cup. Ruth stared at the ceiling and said more to herself than to Patricia. I need to go home. Patricia said the doctors had recommended at minimum 4 more days of observation. Ruth said she understood that. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Then Ruth turned her head and looked at Patricia with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has recently had occasion to reconsider what matters. She said, "Your name is Patricia." Patricia said yes. Ruth said, "Thank you for talking to me when I could not answer." Patricia looked at her water cup. She said it was nothing. Ruth said it was not nothing, and the way she said it left no room for argument. Patricia left at the end of her shift. The room settled into the particular quiet of a hospital at night. The distant sounds of the floor reduced to footsteps and the occasional tone from a monitor down the hall. Ruth lay in the dark with her eyes open and looked at the ceiling. She had been in this bed for 11 days without knowing it. 11 days in which the world had continued operating according to its own logic, making decisions she had not authorized, moving things that did not belong to anyone but her. She understood this the way you understand something you have already prepared for. Harold had prepared her for it too in his way, not by telling her what to do, but by showing her over 30 years that the people who make arrangements in advance are the ones who do not get to find out how necessary those arrangements were. She thought about the pantry. She thought about the latch on the third shelf and the way her fingers had found it 100 times in the dark by feel alone. She thought about the gray metal filing cabinets and Harold's handwriting on the labels and the safe set into the concrete that no one had ever opened but her. She thought about the fact that Dennis had been in that kitchen and had pressed the wrong point on the wrong part of the shelf, and the door had stayed shut, and something in her that she could not quite name felt not triumph, not relief, but a kind of deep structural confirmation, the feeling of a thing that was built correctly holding the way it was supposed to hold. She also thought about Ray, sitting in the back bedroom, writing donate on a box. She could picture exactly a shoebox she had covered in purple craft paper in 1986 and filled over the years with the things her children had made for her. She had not looked inside it in a long time. She did not need to. She knew what was in it. She turned that thought over for a while. Then she set it aside the way she had learned to set things aside that she could not address until she was on her feet, and she closed her eyes and she slept. The following morning, Vera Hutchins finally got inside the house. She had been thinking about the sealed envelope in the papers box for 3 days. She knew it was there, and she knew what it meant that it was still sitting unopened in a donation pile, and she had decided on the drive home from Commerce Street that she was going to do something about it. She brought a container of chicken soup. It was a reasonable reason to knock a practical offering for a house where 3 people were working long hours, and it had the additional virtue of being genuine. Vera had made the soup that morning. Ray answered the door. He looked tired in the specific way of someone carrying something they cannot set down. He thanked her for the soup and held the door open without hesitation. She went to the kitchen to put the soup in the refrigerator and took the long way back through the hallway. The papers box was still in the study under 2 others now. She moved the top 2 boxes with the calm efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years keeping a classroom in order. She found the envelope. It was still sealed. She did not take it. It did not belong to her. But she photographed the front of it with her phone, the return address, the firm name, the phone number printed in small type below the logo. She put the boxes back in their original arrangement and walked to the kitchen. Ray was leaning against the counter eating a granola bar and looking at nothing in particular. She said the soup just needed to be reheated on the stove, not the microwave that Ruth's stove ran a little hot on the left burner, so he should watch it. Ray said okay and thanked her again. She left. That night, sitting at her kitchen table with her phone in her hand, Vera called Walter Briggs one more time. She told him what she had seen in the house that day. The volume of items removed the box of papers, the sealed envelope that had never reached Ruth's hands. Walter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told her that Ruth had updated the trust that morning through a video conference with 2 witnesses and that everything Ruth had wanted to protect was still protected. Vera said she did all of that this morning. Walter said she did. Vera sat with that for a moment. Outside her window, the house on Merritt Lane was dark. The for sale sign caught the light from the street lamp. She said, "Does Ruth know I called you last week?" Walter said she does. "And she asked me to tell you something." Vera waited. He said, "Ruth asked me to tell you that she never forgot who sat with her when Roy was dying, and that she hopes you will sit with her again soon under better circumstances." Vera set the phone down on the table. She looked at the dark house next door for a long time. Across town, Ray Calloway was sitting in his motel room on Route 9 with the television on and the sound muted, watching the images move without following them. He had spent the day moving boxes and answering his wife's texts with brief reassurances and telling himself that what they were doing was the same thing that families did in situations like this one, that it was practical, and that practical was the same as reasonable, and that reasonable was the same as right. He had been running that chain of logic for 4 days, and it was beginning to show signs of wear. He picked up his phone and looked at his mother's contact in his address book. The photo attached to it was from 3 Christmases ago, taken in the kitchen on Merritt Lane. Ruth standing at the counter with a dish towel over her shoulder. Not posed, not aware of the camera, just standing there in her kitchen, looking like the kitchen was exactly where she was supposed to be. He had taken that photo himself. He did not remember taking it. He thought about calling her. Then he remembered she was unconscious in a hospital, and he could not call her, and the specific quality of that impossibility settled over him in a way that the past 4 days of activity had successfully prevented him from feeling directly. He set the phone down on the nightstand and looked at it for a while. He thought about the garage. He had opened the door that afternoon, looked at Harold's tools still hanging on the wall, in the same order Harold had left them 32 years ago, and written "Garage Donate" all on a piece of cardboard without stepping inside. He had done it in under 10 seconds. He had been proud of his efficiency at the time. He was not proud of it now. He turned off the television. He lay in the dark and thought about $38,000 and about a restaurant that had failed and about his father building something in a kitchen wall that nobody knew about for 30 years. And he tried to find the place where those things connected into a logic he could live with. He did not find it that night, but the looking was new, and that was something. The next morning, Dennis's phone rang at 7:45. He was in his car, having come back to park outside the house after a poor night's sleep in a nearby hotel, drinking gas station coffee and watching the street wake up. The call was from the realtor. She said there was a complication with the title. The property had a trust designation that had not shown up in the initial search because it was filed under a secondary instrument, and until the trust documentation was reviewed and cleared, she could not in good conscience proceed with any buyer conversations. She said she was sorry. She said these things happen sometimes with older estates. Dennis sat in the car and looked at his phone after the call ended. He thought about Pete Harlow's scanner in the void space behind the wall. He thought about Walter Briggs' secretary and the word confidential. He thought about his mother's name on a trust document filed years ago quietly without anyone being told. He pulled out and drove toward the hospital. He did not know his mother had already signed herself out. He did not know that at that exact moment, Patricia Nolan was walking Ruth Calloway through the hospital's main corridor toward the exit in a wheelchair, Ruth's coat folded across her lap and her cane balanced across the armrests. He did not know that Ruth had already made 3 phone calls that morning, or that she had asked Patricia quietly whether the garden behind her house was likely to have survived the cold snap earlier in the week. Patricia had said she did not know about the garden. Ruth had said she supposed she would find out soon enough. When Dennis's phone rang again 20 minutes later, the number on the screen was the hospital's main line. A woman from the discharge coordination office told him that his mother had left the facility that morning against the attending physician's recommendation and had arranged her own transportation home. Dennis was already on Highway 36 heading back toward Merritt Lane. He did not speed up. He did not slow down. He drove at exactly the speed limit through the flat October landscape of central Ohio past the corner of Oak and Highway 36, where a retail development now stood on land that had once been someone's considered investment, and he thought about a man who had looked at empty ground and understood something about the future that no one around him had been paying enough attention to see. He turned onto Merritt Lane and saw the for sale sign in the yard, and then he saw his mother standing on the front porch, leaning on her cane, looking at him through the windshield as he pulled into the driveway. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment before getting out of the car. Ruth did not move from the porch. She stood with both hands on the cane watching him, the way a person watches weather approach from a distance, not with fear, not with anticipation, but with the steady patience of someone who has already decided they will not run from it. She had known Dennis for 52 years, had watched him take his first steps on the linoleum floor of this very kitchen, had driven him to his first job interview, and waited in the parking lot without being asked. She knew the specific way his shoulders carried trouble, and right now they were carrying a great deal of it. He got out of the car. He looked at the for sale sign in the yard the way a man looks at something he put there himself, and is only now understanding the full weight of. He said, "Mom." She said, "Come inside, Dennis." It was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the tone of a woman who had decided that what needed to happen would happen indoors, with both of them sitting down, and that nothing useful would be accomplished in a driveway. He followed her up the porch steps, staying close without hovering, and held the front door because her cane required her full attention on the threshold. Inside the house received them with the particular silence of rooms that have been emptied of everything that once gave them sound. Their footsteps were audible now in ways they had not been when the floors were covered with rugs, and the walls held shelving, and the corners contained the accumulated weight of a life in progress. The house had been turned into an echo. Ruth walked through the front room without stopping. She did not look at the walls or the floors. She had already seen what she needed to see on the drive over from the passenger seat in the specific quality of Dennis's silence. Beverly and Ray were in the kitchen. They had not expected Ruth today, and the surprise on their faces was unguarded, the kind of expression people wear before they have time to arrange it into something more appropriate. Beverly recovered first. She said their mother should not have left the hospital this soon, that the doctors had said 4 more days, that there were risks. Ruth looked at her daughter with the directness of a woman who had spent 11 days in a bed thinking about exactly which conversations were worth having and exactly how. She said, "Beverly, I understand what the doctors recommended. I also understand what has been happening in this house for the past 11 days. I made a choice about which one required my immediate attention." Beverly opened her mouth and closed it again. Ray stood near the back door with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the floor between his feet. He had the bearing of someone who knows the accounting is coming and has already accepted that the numbers will not be in his favor. Ruth moved through the kitchen slowly, her cane quiet on the bare floor, and she looked at each of her children in turn before she said another word, not accusatory, not theatrical. She simply looked at them the way she had looked at them when they were small and had done something that disappointed her with the full weight of her knowledge of who they were and who she had believed they might become. Then she turned to the pantry. Dennis stepped forward without thinking. He said, "Mom, what are you doing?" She opened the pantry door. The shelves were almost bare. A few cans of crushed tomatoes, a box of oatmeal, a jar of honey that no one had thought worth taking. The back wall of the pantry stood plain and undisturbed, the wood surface worn smooth in places from decades of hands reaching past it for things on the shelves. Dennis stared at the back of that cabinet. He had spent days looking at it. He had pressed every surface he could reach with any logical intention. He had brought equipment and expertise in the specific ambition of a man who needed to know what was behind it, and it had given him nothing. Ruth reached in with her right hand past the second shelf and placed 3 fingers at a point on the third shelf where the grain of the wood met itself at an angle, a detail so small and so consistent with the natural variation of the material that it registered as nothing unless you knew to look for it. Harold had shown her this point with his hand over hers, pressing gently until the mechanism engaged, and she had practiced it enough times over the following years that the motion lived in her fingers the way a combination lives in a safecracker's hands. She pressed. The sound was small and clean and final. The back panel of the pantry shifted inward along its left edge, pivoting on a hinge set deep in the framing, and swung open into darkness. Nobody in the kitchen spoke. The smell came first, the particular atmosphere of a sealed space that had been kept at a stable temperature for many years, cool and dry and faintly metallic with the presence of documents and steel. Then the light from the kitchen reached into the opening and found the shapes inside. The gray metal of the filing cabinets. The labeled boxes in Harold's handwriting, thick and deliberate. The bulk of the safe set into the concrete of the foundation, its dial face catching the light like a closed eye. Ray made a sound that was not quite a word. Dennis stood very still. Beverly looked at this open panel, then at her mother's back, then at the open panel again with the expression of someone recalculating a problem they had believed was already solved. Ruth stepped into the room. Her cane touched the concrete floor, and the sound of it was different here, denser. The sound of a foundation that had been laid to last. She moved to the nearest filing cabinet and placed her palm flat on its top surface for a moment, not opening it, just resting her hand there, and the gesture had the quality of a greeting between people who have not seen each other in some time. She said your father built this room in the summer of 1991. He worked alone on the weekends. He told me he was reinforcing the kitchen wall. That was technically accurate. She pulled the top drawer of the cabinet open. The sound of the metal runner was smooth and unhesitant, the mechanism maintained against corrosion by the dry, sealed air of the room. She removed a folder and carried it to the kitchen table. She set it down and opened it, and the contents fanned slightly in the light. Property deeds, survey maps, purchase agreements, recorded easements, the full documented history of land acquired quietly over the course of a decade by a man who drove a second-hand truck and brought his lunch to work in a paper bag. Dennis came to the table. He stood over the documents and began reading, and as he read, his professional understanding of what he was looking at overtook every other thing he was feeling. He turned pages. He found addresses he recognized. He found parcel numbers that corresponded to corners of Harwick he drove through weekly. He found the deed for the lot on Oak and Highway 36 where the anchor tenant of the largest retail development in the county had been paying ground lease for 19 years. His voice when he finally spoke was very quiet. He said, "These are worth millions." It was not a question. It was a man in his professional area of knowledge arriving at a number and understanding that the number was real. Beverly had come to stand on the other side of the table. She looked at the documents with an expression that moved through several phases too quickly to name each one separately. She said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" It was also not quite a question. It had the syntax of one but the weight of something else, an accounting, an attempt to locate where in the timeline of her life this information should have appeared and did not. Ruth looked at her daughter across the table. She said, "Because your father wanted to know who his children were before they knew what they stood to gain. 32 years of watching you build your lives, I never found a reason to think he was wrong." Beverly was quiet. Ray had come to the doorway of the hidden room and was standing at his threshold, looking in without entering. He said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "He never told any of us." Ruth said, "He told me, and I kept it because he asked me to, and because I believed he was right, and because in 32 years of thinking it over, I have never found a reason to disagree with him." She closed the folder. She said, "I have an appointment with Walter Briggs on Thursday. I expect all three of you to be there." Nobody argued. The office of Walter Briggs occupied the second floor of a brick building on Commerce Street that had been constructed in 1923 and renovated carefully enough that it still felt like 1923 in the best possible sense. The floors were dark wood. The windows were tall. The furniture was heavy and meant to last. Walter himself fit the room in the way that certain men fit their professions so completely that you could not picture them anywhere else. 60 years old, compact and deliberate, with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that patience was the most efficient use of time available. He had laid the documents on the conference table before any of them arrived. When Ruth came in with her cane, he stood and shook her hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake required. He said he was glad to see her upright. She said she intended to stay that way. Dennis, Beverly, and Ray filed in behind her. They took chairs on the opposite side of the table from Walter without being directed, which said something about how they understood the geometry of the meeting. Walter sat down, opened the file, and began. He explained the trust plainly, without condescension, and without leaving room for misunderstanding. The Ruth and Harold Calloway Family Trust had been established in 1998. It held all real property and investment assets associated with the estate. During Ruth's lifetime, and while she retained legal capacity, no transfer, sale, or encumbrance of any trust asset could occur without her direct written authorization. The contracts that had been discussed with the real estate agent, the conversations with the buyer's representative, the title inquiry filed at the county recorder's office, none of these had any legal effect on the trust assets. They were void. Dennis said, "Why didn't your office contact us when she was admitted to the hospital?" Walter said, "We sent correspondence to the property address. It was not opened." The table was quiet. Beverly did not look at Dennis, and Dennis did not look at Beverly, but the awareness of the unsealed envelope moved between them like something physical. Dennis said, "We didn't know there was a trust." Walter said, "That is correct. You did not know, and that was your mother's legal right." Dennis looked at Ruth. There was something in his face that had not been there at the beginning of this week, a quality of reckoning that was distinct from guilt and not quite the same as regret, but shared borders with both. He said, "Mom, we didn't know." Ruth looked at him. She said, "You didn't ask." The room received that. Walter waited a measured moment and then continued. He described the structure of the Harwick Medical Foundation allocation, a substantial endowment directed toward outpatient stroke recovery services for patients without adequate insurance coverage. He described the Harold Callaway Scholarship Fund, which would support women raising children alone who were pursuing small business ownership, the kind of work Harold had believed in, the kind of work he had wanted other people to have the chance to attempt. Ray stood up. He did not shout. His voice was controlled, and the control of it was more telling than volume would have been. He said that he was a blood relative of both Ruth and Harold Callaway, that he had been raised in that house on Merritt Lane, that he had a legitimate claim as a natural heir, and that redirecting the majority of the estate to outside organizations while leaving the three children with a fraction of what they were entitled to was not something he was prepared to accept without legal challenge. Ruth looked at her youngest child. She had known Ray for 45 years. She had held him on the first night of his life in that same brick house, while Harold paced the hallway outside, unable to sit still, with so much joy in the building. She had watched him grow into a man who was genuinely kind in small moments and consistently unable to hold that kindness steady when the pressure increased. She had watched him stand in the doorway of the garage on the day they were clearing it and close the door without going in, because going in would have meant staying a minute longer with something he did not know how to carry. She said, "Ray, what have you done with what your father and I gave you over the past 45 years? He said, "That's not the point." She said, "It is exactly the point. It has always been the point. Your father spent 20 years building something from nothing because he believed that what a man leaves behind should mean something, that it should go to work in the world. He believed that long before he had anything to leave. I have had 32 years to think about whether he was right. I have decided that he was." Ray sat down. Walter continued without changing his tone. He said that each of the three children would receive a distribution from the liquid assets of the trust. The amount was sufficient to provide material stability without constituting a windfall. He read the number. Nobody responded to it the way people respond to numbers that solve their problems. It was enough, and it was also a statement, and everyone in the room understood both things simultaneously. Then Walter said, "There is one additional provision." He turned a page. He said that the property at Merritt Lane would not be sold. Ruth would continue to live there for the remainder of her life. Upon her death, the property would transfer to the Harwick Medical Foundation to be used as a community resource center serving elderly residents of the county, to be named in perpetuity the Harold and Ruth Callaway House. Nobody in the room could change this. Walter said so plainly. The provision had been structured with specific intent to survive any subsequent legal challenge from named beneficiaries. Harold had insisted on this language in the original document, and Ruth had affirmed it in the update. The house would outlast all of them doing the work they had not done. Dennis looked at his mother for a long time. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked at his hands. Beverly was very still. She had the expression of a woman processing information that required the revision of a story she had been telling herself for a long time. The story had been, "I left Harwick and built my own life and asked for nothing and owed nothing." The revision was more complicated, and she was not finished with it yet. Walter closed the file. He said he would give them a few minutes and stepped out of the room. The three of them sat with their mother in the old office with the tall windows and the heavy furniture, and nobody spoke for longer than was comfortable, and then a little longer than that. Beverly said, "Finally, I found the envelope from your attorney in the papers. I didn't open it." Ruth said, "I know." Beverly said, "I should have opened it." Ruth said, "Yes." That was the whole of it. Beverly did not ask for more, and Ruth did not offer more, and the brevity of the exchange carried everything that a longer conversation would have taken an hour to cover. Beverly was the first of the three to stand. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair and held it for a moment without putting it on, looking at the table. Then she looked at her mother. She did not say what she was thinking, which was this: she had left Harik at 22 and built something real and worked harder than most people she knew, and never once asked her parents for money or help or anything beyond the ordinary gestures of a family that was still technically intact. She had considered this a point of pride. She had considered it proof of something. Standing in Walter Briggs' conference room on a Thursday afternoon in October, she understood for the first time that the story she had been telling herself was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in ways she had not been able to see because she had not been standing in the right place to see them. Her parents had not needed her to ask for help. They had needed her to show up. Those were not the same thing, and she had spent 27 years not knowing the difference. She put on her jacket. She said goodbye to Walter in the hallway, shook his hand, and walked down the stairs to Commerce Street. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the October air. Then she called David and told him she would not be home tonight after all. He asked why. She said she thought she should stay in Harwick for a few days. He said okay. She hung up and stood there a while longer, looking up the street toward the direction of Merritt Lane, thinking about a pantry door that had been 3 feet from her hands every time she had visited this house for 20 years, and that she had never once thought to look at twice. Ray left without saying much. He shook Walter's hand in the hallway, nodded at his mother, and walked down the stairs with the particular gait of a man who has been told a hard truth and is still deciding whether to argue with it. Ruth watched him go and felt the specific grief of a parent who loves a child completely and without illusion. Dennis stayed. When the others were gone and Walter had excused himself with the practiced discretion of a man who understood that the legal portion of the day was complete and something else was beginning, Dennis moved to the chair beside his mother rather than across the table from her. The change in position was small, and it was not small at all. He said, "I found the note Dad left in your desk. I've been carrying it in my jacket since the day after you went to the hospital." Ruth said, "I know." He said, "I tried to find the room. I had Pete Harlow run a scanner, and I stood in front of that pantry pressing every surface I could reach. I couldn't find it." She said, "Your father designed it that way." He said, "Yeah, he did." There was a silence between them that was different from the one in the conference room. That silence had been the silence of reckoning. This one was closer to the silence of two people who have run out of the things they were supposed to say and have arrived unexpectedly at the things that were true. Dennis said, "I remember the smell of his shop, the garage, motor oil and sawdust. He was always in there. I never asked him what he was building." Ruth said, "He never needed you to ask. He just needed you to be around." Dennis looked at the window. The light on Commerce Street was the flat, honest light of a Midwest October afternoon, the kind of light that does not flatter anything but does not lie about anything either. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I know that's not enough." She said, "It's a beginning." She stood slowly and he stood with her. At the door she stopped and turned back to him, and her voice when she spoke had the quality of something that had been held for a long time and was now being set down in the right place. She said, "Your father kept that room locked for 30 years, not because he didn't trust the world. He kept it locked because he trusted me. There is a difference. I hope you live long enough to understand what that difference feels like from the inside." She went out. Dennis stood in the old office for another minute alone with the heavy furniture and the tall windows and the particular quality of a room where consequential things had just been decided. Then he followed her down the stairs. He drove her home. It was 12 minutes from Commerce Street to Merritt Lane, and for the first 10 of those minutes, neither of them said anything. Dennis kept his eyes on the road. Ruth looked out the passenger window at Harwick, moving past the streets she had driven for 40 years, the storefronts that had changed and the ones that had not the corner where the old hardware store used to be, and where a cell phone retailer was now the park where she had taken 3 small children on Saturday mornings when Harold worked. Dennis said, without looking at her, "I called Pete Harlow the same night I found Dad's note." Ruth said, "I know." He said, "I wasn't thinking about whether it was right. I was thinking about what was behind the wall." She said, "I understand that." He glanced over at her. She was still looking out the window, her cane across her lap, her hands folded over it. He said, "Did you ever think about just telling us when we were grown, when it might have made a difference?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought about it when you started your business. I thought about it when Beverly made partner. I thought about it when Ray called me at midnight and told me about the restaurant." She paused. "Each time I thought about it, I asked myself what your father would have done. And each time, the answer was the same. Dennis turned onto Merritt Lane. The for sale sign was still in the yard, the realtor's logo visible from 50 feet away. He would call her tomorrow and cancel the listing. He had been thinking about that since Walter Briggs closed the file. He pulled into the driveway and put the car in park but did not get out. He said, what would he have done? Ruth opened the car door. She said exactly what he did. She got out, steadied herself with the cane, and walked toward the porch without looking back. Dennis sat in the car for a moment. Then he got out and followed her. The house on Merritt Lane received Ruth back the way old houses receive people who have been absent too long, with the slightly altered quality of a place that has been waiting, not entirely still holding its breath. She stood in the front room for a moment after Dennis dropped her off, looking at the shape of the emptiness. The rugs were gone. The shelves were bare. The walls held the rectangular memories of things that had hung on them, but the structure was the same. The bones of it, the framing that Harold had put his hands on and known, were exactly as they had always been. She walked through each room, once not the inventory she had made when she first came home reading what was absent. This time she was noting what remained. The light switches in the same places they had always been. The particular angle of the hallway at the top of the stairs. The second step from the bottom with its slight give, a characteristic that Harold had meant to fix and never had, and which Ruth had long since stopped thinking of as a flaw and started thinking of as a signature. Vera appeared at the front door 40 minutes later with a potted plant in each hand, spearmint on the left and a small rosemary on the right. She said she did not know what Ruth had lost and what she still had and what could be replaced, but she knew that green things were a reasonable place to start. Ruth held the door open and Vera came in and set the plants on the kitchen windowsill where the light was best. Patricia arrived an hour after that, still in her work clothes, carrying a bag from the diner on Fifth Street. She said she had a double shift starting at 6 and could not stay long, but she wanted to make sure Ruth had eaten a real meal at a table and not from a hospital tray. The three women sat on the kitchen floor because there were no chairs yet, with the bag of food open between them and the afternoon light coming through the window and falling across the two green plants on the sill. They ate without ceremony. Vera talked about her garden and what she needed to pull before the first hard frost. Patricia described a patient from her last shift who had asked her to read aloud from a fishing magazine for 45 minutes and had fallen asleep before she finished the second article. Ruth listened to both of them and ate her soup and felt the specific, unreplicable sensation of being in the right place. After a while, the conversation quieted and they sat in the kind of easy silence that is only available to people who have passed through something difficult together and come out the other side, still facing the same direction. Ruth looked at the pantry door. It was closed the same as it had always been from the outside, unremarkable in every visible way. She got up carefully, using the windowsill for support, and walked to it. She opened it and looked at the back panel, closed now the way Harold had always left it, the seam invisible to anyone who was not looking with the right kind of knowledge. She reached in and pressed the point on the third shelf. The panel opened. She did not go in. She simply held the door open and looked into the small room, where 30 years of careful work waited in gray metal drawers, the room her husband had built with his hands and his belief in the future. The room that had outlasted everything anyone had tried to do to the house around it. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the small key, the one from the envelope Harold had left in her desk, the one that opened the safe set into the foundation. She held it for a moment, then she placed it on the first shelf of the pantry in plain sight, where it would be easy to find. Vera, watching from across the kitchen, has said, "Is that safe to leave out?" Ruth said, "The secret has done its work." She closed the pantry door. She went back to the windowsill and leaned against it beside the two green plants, looking at the kitchen. Patricia and Vera were still sitting on the floor looking up at her. The afternoon light was going amber now, the way October light does in Ohio when it starts thinking about evening. Ruth thought about Harold in the garage on Saturday mornings, the particular sound of him working, the way the whole house organized itself around his presence without anyone having to say so. She thought about what it had cost him to keep the secret and what it had cost her to keep it after him, the years of watching her children move away and build lives she was glad they had, and quietly grieve the distance between those lives and the one she had lived in this house. She thought about the room behind the pantry wall and what it had been, not just a storage space, not just a financial instrument, but a demonstration, a 30-year argument made in concrete and steel, that some things are worth protecting because of what they say about who you are, not because of what they can be exchanged for. Outside on Merritt Lane, the October trees were past their peak, but not yet bare. A few doors down, a man was raking leaves into a pile with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this same task in this same yard for many years, and finds in the repetition not boredom, but a kind of conversation with time. Vera noticed Ruth looking out the window and said, "What are you thinking about?" Ruth said, "I'm thinking about the garden. The tomatoes need to come in before the freeze." Vera said she would help tomorrow morning. Patricia said she would come by after her shift ended at 2. Ruth said, "I'll make coffee." She said it the way people say things that have been true for a long time and will continue to be true, not as a promise, but as a statement of fact, the kind of fact that does not require emphasis because it has never been in question. An hour after Patricia and Vera left, there was a knock at the front door. Ruth was sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, resting when she heard it. She called out and Beverly let herself in. She was carrying 2 folding chairs she had bought from the hardware store 2 blocks away, still in their plastic wrapping. She set them down in the kitchen without ceremony. She said, "I figured you needed somewhere to sit." Ruth looked at the chairs. She said, "You stayed." Beverly said, "I said I would." She opened one of the chairs and set it up near the window, then opened the second and set it beside it. She stood back and looked at them. They were plain aluminum chairs, the kind that cost $14 and last 20 years. They looked exactly right in the empty kitchen. Beverly said, "I'm going to drive back to Columbus tomorrow, but I wanted to ask you something first." Ruth waited. Beverly said, "The envelope from Mr. Briggs. The one I didn't open." She stopped. She started again. "Was there anything in it that would have changed what we did?" Ruth looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she said there was a letter explaining the trust. If you had read it, you would have understood that the house was never available to sell. All of it would have stopped immediately. Beverly nodded slowly. She sat down in one of the new chairs. She said, "I put it in the donation box." Ruth said, "I know." Beverly looked at her hands in her lap. She said, "I'm not sure what to do with that." Ruth said, "You could start by coming back in the spring. The garden needs more than one person." Beverly looked up. It was not the response she had been expecting, which was perhaps the point. She said, "I can do that." She stayed another hour. They sat in the 2 new chairs by the window and talked about small things, the garden, Beverly's drive back, whether the hardware store on 5th Street still carried the same brand of light bulbs Ruth preferred. It was the most ordinary conversation they had had in years, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so because some things are better understood in the having of them than in the naming. Before she left, Vera set something on the kitchen counter beside the 2 plants, a small leather-bound notebook she had rescued from the papers box on the day she had gone in for the soup. She had not known what it was. She had only known it did not belong in a donation box and that Ruth would want to decide its fate herself. Ruth picked it up. She opened the front cover. Her husband's handwriting. The date, August 1991. The first line read, "Notes on the Eastern parcels and the reasons I believe in them. For Ruth, who is the reason I believe in anything." She stood at the kitchen counter and read the first page slowly. It was not a love letter. It was a working document, columns of figures and property addresses, and the careful reasoning of a man who had looked at a map of his county and understood something about where things were going that other people had not yet seen. But running through the margins in the small spaces between the entries were notes that had nothing to do with land values. A reminder to pick up Ruth's prescription on the way home. A note that Dennis had his first soccer game on Saturday. A question written and then half crossed out. Should I tell her now or wait until I'm sure? He had waited. He had been sure. Ruth closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it on the kitchen windowsill beside the spearmint and the rosemary in the last of the afternoon light. She had lived in this house for 41 years. She intended to live in it for whatever years remained to her. And when those years were done, the house would go on doing work in the world the way Harold had always believed good work continued past the moment of its making. She thought that was enough. More than enough. She finished her tea and set the cup on the counter and listened to the house.